Welcome to the Media Roundtable Special Edition. I'm your host, Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road and civil discourse enthusiast. We have a very special show for you today because we have two titanic forces across the political landscape over the last few decades joining us. We have Kellyanne Conway, who is the former campaign manager and senior counselor to President Trump. She's the first woman to have run a successful U.S. presidential campaign. She is also co-host of the podcast, The Campaign Managers, alongside of our second guest, David Plouffe. David is a political and business strategist. He is the former campaign manager to Barack Obama's successful 2008 bid for the election, and he served as senior advisor to the president under Obama from 2011 to 2015. He is the other half of the co-host team behind the new podcast that we're here to talk about, The Campaign Manager. So welcome both of you to the show. Thank you for making time.
Great to be with you, Dan.
Thank you.
And what a week to be talking. It is the 23rd of July when we're having this conversation. Not much has been going on our side of the world. You know, we do this podcast for what we call the chief audio officer, and that's a business decision maker who is responsible for the success of campaigns that they run in audio. So there's like only a few thousand of these people in the world, but they are the driving force behind this industry. And really the whole audio industry, which is actually about a $36 billion international business. And so we talk a lot about the goings on in our business. We just had everybody come to LA last week while the convention was going on. We had our chief audio officer summit. We had 30% of the podcast industry represented in one room, really just talking about people, profit, and purpose. How do we build relationships with each other to help each other grow? How do we do better as strategists and tacticians to get better results from campaigns? And then how does the work that we do in audio and the shows that we support, how does that advance our values? And how do we make sure that we're dealing with that in responsible ways? These are some of the themes that we've been talking about. In your world and in the rest of the world, we're coming out of a televised attempted assassination, a president saying, I'm in, and then he says, I'm out. And it seems like we now have what appears to be a presumptive nominee in Kamala Harris to pick up where he left off. So where do we begin on that? Guys, I guess if first things first, if you would mind just reacting from your point of view to everything that has just happened in this country and what it means for the campaign going forward. Maybe that would be a nice place to start. Kellyanne, would you mind just sharing a little bit from your perspective?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. It's been an incredibly newsy time. You had President Trump, thankfully, surviving an assassin's bullet and then showing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin early. And throughout the convention, that was crowned with his particular address to the nation. I thought particularly the first 28 to 30 minutes of it were calling for unity. And then he had his greatest hits of policy contrast between him and Biden-Harris. Also, something happened this week, which is that Kimberly Cheadle, the director of the Secret Service, resigned after coming under fire left, right, and center in a very bipartisan fashion for the security breaches and failures to protect the former and perhaps future president. Listen, nobody should cheer when somebody gets fired, et cetera, but when they're incompetent, don't have answers, it's important because these presidents, current, future, perhaps, and certainly past, and the first ladies for the rest of their lives, have Secret Service protection for a reason. There are a lot of crazy people out there who would do them harm. So we need to be right 100% of the time. The assassins or terrorists have to be right one time. And we all learned that in the hard way on 9/11, if not other times. So I think this is an important development as well. Look, Kamala Harris in some ways represents a continuation of the Biden-Harris administration, the policies. Many Democrats have rolled their eyes about her for a while, really didn't have a lot of confidence in her competence. They seem to be some of the same people excited now, stroking checks, pretending it was her all along. But that doesn't erase the fact that she has polled even worse against Trump, as has Biden. Typically, that could change. That Donald Trump is still beating her in the betting odds, in the swing state polls, that could change. these things will tighten. David Plouffe and I know and have said many times before this latest development politically that the race has really come down to a handful of votes across a few states, not millions of votes across the country. You have to win the Electoral College, not just prove you're electable, but actually win the Electoral College, get more votes than the other person. Politics is not about biology or even chemistry. It's about math and science. Just get more electoral votes than your opponent. This is how you win. Having said that, you know, Kamala's, I think that Vice President Harris is her campaign on her own in 2019 was a complete disaster, withdrew in December of 2019 without a single Democrat delegate to speak of, highly criticized for not being able to meet that moment when it was her own campaign, has shed close to 30 senior staffers as vice president, many of whom complained to the Washington Post and Politico and elsewise that she doesn't want to do the work. So we'll see where that goes. Having said that, as much as things are not going to change, they are. Because anytime you have a new entrant, a new dynamic, some shifting sands beneath you that perhaps were not, that you could not have predicted, or even if it was possible, and I think the Trump campaign was ready for the possibility of Kamala or someone else, when it actually happens, that's when everybody is tested. And you are now running against a female of color who doesn't mind using race and gender as those calling cards. She will try to hearken to history. It didn't really work for Hillary because she didn't have that relatability and that connective tissue with enough voters, didn't put herself out there in states like Michigan and Wisconsin enough to stem the tidal wave of the Trump 2016 campaign. But we don't know what will happen. I think raising the money, wrapping up the delegates, getting Joe Biden's support immediately, getting the support of the Democratic leadership, the rank and file for all intents and purposes, means that it's Kamala's moment. Will she melt or will she shine in that spotlight? That's an open question. One last point. President Trump comes off the convention. Even his naysayers and critics have commended the content, I think the optics, and a lot of the tone, the unifying tone, the expanding the electoral map, not contracting, and the contrast to the Democratic Party, which has been in disarray. The Democrats now have 3 or 4 weeks to respond to that convention with their own. And the question is, will they talk more about Kamala or more about Donald Trump? It's an important question. But I think there are swing voters who are still not totally dialed in and tuned into this race. And you can expect them through these conventions, through the next presidential debates, through the vice presidential pick and contest, to be a little bit more dialed in. The issue set hasn't changed. The top of the ticket for the Democrats barely has, but as she is held to account to answer for her failures as board czar, for prosecuting people for marijuana charges, putting them in jail, and yet saying that a lot of, I think giving money to this Minnesota Freedom Fund and also telling people to do the same while murderers and assaulters let out of jail. She's got a lot to answer for. She's going to have her moment in the sun, an extended moment. And I think that the Trump campaign should keep doing what they were doing with their very sturdy infrastructure built to last, but at the same time, adapt to this new candidacy. In 2020, the Trump campaign never really adapted to COVID as the issue that was on many people's minds for those couple months, if not into election day. And when you don't adapt, it hurts you politically.
Thank you for that. Yeah, go ahead, David, please.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting is, and Kellyanne and I gather every week. I mean, the last couple of months has been pretty incredible in terms of just events. That being said, we live in a divided country where there's not that many people that decide the election. So you're not seeing these massive swings. My sense is Kamala Harris gives Democrats a better chance simply because, in all the polling that we've seen, including private polling that's not public, Joe Biden was significantly trailing Democratic Senate candidates who were winning some of these battleground states like Pennsylvania, even in Arizona, comfortably in Wisconsin, ahead in Michigan. So if she's able to kind of get some of that base back, I think this becomes a really close race again. I thought that there was elements of the Republican convention that were strong, including Kellyanne's own speech. I thought the weakest part was actually Trump's speech, which was the most important one. And I think that does, I think I'm in violent agreement with Kellyanne that, Kamala Harris will either meet this moment and she will be greatly enhanced by that or not. And this is, it's hard to describe what a withering spotlight it is. And lots of vice presidents have run, but you're kind of off Broadway, you're not the main event. All of a sudden you're the biggest news story in the world. And with that comes a lot of opportunity, but a lot of pressure, a lot of challenge. And so, my sense is if by the time of the Democratic convention, she's been able to withstand this, introduce herself to America effectively, lay out the contrast she wants to campaign on in this race, continue to build the organization, have a good convention. All of those things are hard to do, but if they happen, my guess is we could be back to where we were, earlier in the year, where we were in 20, where we were in 16, like a super close race. That's not where the race has been the last month. Donald Trump's had an advantage. So we'll see. But maybe we're done with surprises, but given this year, I'm sure there's more to come. So we will see.
I just wonder if you're both looking at this election and going, man, I'm glad that I'm not doing what I was doing right now. Or if you're saying, oh, I wish I could be back in that spot right now. I imagine it's the former.
Well, listen, I think, every job's hard that anybody in the world has. That's why it's called a job, right? Not play, but hopefully a lot of people hopefully can work in jobs that they get value out of and enjoy. I think Kelly and I would both say, like, working in the White House, privilege of a lifetime. We both spent decades in campaigns, various levels, ending up running a presidential campaign. You have to pinch yourself. That being said, they're super hard to go through. I mean, they grind you down. So I think the issue as you look at it is, no, of course, there's some of the best times of your life, but you have sympathy for those, like on the Trump campaign, and we're trying now to turn on a dime and say, now we have a new opponent. You've got the Biden campaign, that's now the Harris campaign. These folks are being put under great strain. And I think anyone who works on a presidential campaign, I mean, there's some people who are in it for themselves, but most of them, they do it because they deeply believe in their candidate and they deeply believe that their country ought to go in a certain direction. So beneath the like wins and losses and how many states are blue or red on the map on election night, you just feel this added pressure, like it really matters, right? And so I admire people who are in the arena.
Okay, pop quiz. Have you ever heard of these companies? Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John. We could go on. I don't just host the Media Roundtable podcast, but I have the good fortune of being the CEO of a company called Oxford Road, where we are the world's leading independently owned and operated agency specializing in audio. Think podcasts, radio, and streaming. And what that means is that we get to help great companies worth fighting for, grow with audio advertising, whether it's podcasts, radio, or streaming, and all its various tentacles. This includes media planning and buying. We do analytics, attribution, and insights. We also have a special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. It's our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. Bottom line is, we don't just work here. Audio is our passion, and we want to lead this industry to new heights beyond what we've ever seen so far. That's why we've been leading the industry in brand safety and suitability and actually bringing you solutions to market so that you can evaluate the way that you get placed in a show so that it matches up with your values, in addition to avoiding the things that might be problematic for your brand. If you're a chief audio officer and you're looking to get best in market performance at maximum viable scale, do get in touch with us at oxfordroad.com. Or if you love audio and are strategic, relentless, and looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as a fellow agent of influence. Just flip us your resume through oxfordroad.com. And if you're working anywhere in the audio industry and you're serious about this business, make sure you go to oxfordroad.com, easy to spell. Sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer, at oxfordroad.com. And make sure you mention that you heard about us on the Media Roundtable podcast.
Well, I appreciate that we just got to get a little sample of what your podcast is about, the campaign managers. And I want to talk about that because, what we're trying to do here is highlight shows that advertisers should probably give some extra consideration to. And I think from my point of view, we've had this agency for 11 years. I've been in the business for 2 decades. And it is so common to see content creators exploiting our differences to get numbers. And what's interesting with what you've done as a concept is that you said, hey, look, we could not be further at the top of our fields, and we could not be more different in how we approach the issues. And yet we are going to maintain levels of respect and actually come together in the same podcast. I feel like that's the type of content that we've been asking for, because so much of it has become so toxic for brands to get near. I'd like to hear from you both, starting with you, Kellyanne. Why did you decide to do this show with David?
Well, David Plouffe came to me. It was his idea about a year ago, and I thought it was an inspired idea. And I thought to myself, why hasn't this happened before? And the answer is really people are afraid to go first. They are afraid to alienate their quote base or their friends or family members to say, in the case certainly has happened to David, why would you do that with Kellyanne Conway? Because you just always have to punish and dismiss and denigrate and ridicule the other side, try to destroy them, honestly. So that's not helpful. And I think it's not the way most Americans look at politics anyway. Most Americans don't want to do what David and I do. They don't want to wear the blue and red uniform 24/7, 366 since it's leap year. Instead, they want to understand what the policy contrasts are. Those candidates who refuse to have a full conversation with America about their platform, about their vision, about their plans and their intentions, I think they get punished at the ballot box often, because people not only accept, but they expect a full, robust conversation about the policy prescriptions. People are hurting. They're very frustrated right now. They think there's a lack of fairness in this country. They're worried economically. They're worried security-wise, safety-wise. They're worried about what's going on in hot spots around the world. So if they're worried, you can't respond to them as many Republican candidates did in 2022 with inflation, Biden, Putin, border, dimension. Those are barely words, not even sentences. So I feel like we can have a full conversation. I respect David Plouffe and his work. I respect him as a husband, a father, a citizen. I hope that my ideas and candidates and causes prevail and his don't do as well. There's no question about that. But we need to reflect the fact that this is a divided country. Some of our households and families are divided over politics. Many of our places of worship, places of work, kids, schools, and you name everywhere you look, people are divided, and we will continue to be culturally cleaved and politically divided unless and until someone says, that's okay. Thomas Jefferson said, opinion is power. Have one. That's great. But instead of focusing on the 13, 15, 18 things on which we agree, people are so focused on the one or two that bring them to fisticuffs. That's not helpful at all. Anybody who's in a relationship or a marriage knows you don't agree 90% of the time, not 100% of the time, 105% of the time. But you show mutual respect and love, and you try to understand the other point of view. And when you can, you compromise. When you can't, it's just that simple. So we're just trying to reflect the conversations that are happening or should be happening more around the cappuccino counter, proverbial kitchen table. And one last thing on that. There are very few people alive right now who have worked at the top echelons of a presidential campaign and been successful at it the way David Plouffe and I have. There's very few. I didn't want to start naming them because I would be excluding some, but it's on two hands perhaps. And it's a small elite club because it's really tough to do. It's tough for these candidates to win. And President Trump in 2016 and Barack Obama in 2008 represented departures for their parties, if not the nation, of what those parties, the route they were going at the time. And these were two relative outsiders and newcomers to politics who came in and shook up the system. And that's what the country said they wanted for decades. But the first time they really did that was in 2008, followed by 2016. So I hope we can continue to have this conversation together. I hope we can continue to respond to the news, not just react, but reflect. And that's what's incredibly important about our conversation, our tone.
And David, what's your vision for it? And do you get a hard time? Do you guys get a hard time from people that you know about doing this?
I don't.
No.
Kellyanne hasn't. I have. So Dan, yeah. So, I had a podcast in the last two election cycles, 20 and 22, called Campaign HQ, which I really liked. I was the single host and, would talk to reporters and operatives, but for the most part, it was, the reporters, kind of span the spectrum, but the operatives I talked to either tended to be Democrats or, kind of never Trump Republicans. And so I just thought if I did a podcast this time, I didn't want to do that. I felt like something was missing. Like I think listeners need to understand, how the other party and people who understand the other party and how they run and win races think. So I talked to my agent and I said, is there somebody from Trump world who, was in a senior role? I was a manager, so Kellyanne made sense. The one line for me was it had to be someone who acknowledged the election results of last time, which Kellyanne did. Mm-hmm. But the idea is, yes, I've gotten some grief for doing it. I continue to get grief for doing it, just because I think Kellyanne is seen, by folks in my party, as a really malevolent figure. I might be, maybe I'm not, I'm not seeing that. It's also been a long time since I was on the stage. But what I've heard consistently from folks in my party who do listen to it, people I respect in the business community, is they learn something, because I have a pretty good sense about how to run and win a presidential campaign for a Democratic candidate. Kellyanne has a very good understanding of how to do that for a Republican candidate. She also knows Donald Trump very well. I knew Joe Biden very well. I also know Kamala Harris. So I feel like there's a practitioner's lens we bring to this. So of course we're going to comment on the news of the day, but when we talk about how to prepare for a debate or how the campaigns ought to be thinking about early vote or the conventions, we're not pontificating, we're doing it based on our experience. So I think to the extent that people have a 360-degree view of how both sides see the election, that doesn't mean that, Kellyanne won't say something about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris that Democrats don't like, or I'll say something about Donald Trump that Republicans don't like. But I think for people who take the campaign seriously, want to understand a little bit more about what's going on and what's important and what's not, I think it's important. And I think I do believe, listen, Barack Obama has always believed that there's value in listening to other opinions, being willing to occupy space with people who you might not agree with on everything, because lots of times, to make any progress, you've got to work with people who you may disagree with on everything, but you might agree on one thing. That could be an issue, right, in a state legislature or city council. So to me, and I think in today's social media age, that's hard, because everyone's a hero, everyone's a villain, everybody's painted in a certain way. But, my view is this podcast for people who care about what's happening in the presidential campaign has been a really good addition, both in terms of the concept that, we come from different parties, but also just that we know what we're talking about most of the time anyway. And I think there's value in that.
So, there's look, we all know about polarization and where that's come from, and people say politics is downstream from culture. I believe that culture is downstream from media, and I wonder if you both would agree that we have to see a change in media in terms of how we treat people who see things differently than we do before we start to see change in culture and potentially in politics. Do you buy that, or what do you think?
You're asking Kellyanne Conway that? Well, sure. David used a pretty strong word to describe the way people on his side would view me, but they didn't do that before Donald Trump won. In fact, they didn't do that throughout the campaign. They couldn't get enough of me. I was on every show all day long, which was great because we were underestimated and underdog, but we were also understaffed and under-resourced. And Hillary Clinton over there in Brooklyn had about 1,000 employees, had one person in charge of one county in Pennsylvania. We had like one person in charge of 3 states. And the implicit bargain in 2016 was, this is fun. This is great. We have somebody who can go on when Mr. Trump can't, or when Governor Pence can't, and explain what's happening, explain the electoral map. Why are you going to Michigan? Why is he going to Minnesota? Why is he giving a speech about this, that, and the other? And explain and be credible and likable, as they all said, if you need to ever see the text. But as soon as he won, it was like, no. The bargain was, this is all over on election day and Hillary becomes the first president. They never thought he could actually win. And then the media turned, the coverage turned almost immediately. The Saturday Night Live skits turned from, cute banter, soft jabs here and there to mean. And it's okay. I don't think it's really fair to my kids. So when I can vomit on people's words like, oh, we must protect the children, we must do this. Certainly it was treated differently. And the minute my husband went from crying in his Make America Great Again hat on election night to she did it, accepting a job with Donald Trump, to somehow changing his mind about Donald Trump, if not me, he became a hero. So it's, it all sounds all good and fine for people to say, well, gee, we need to be more positive. We need to be nicer. I'm a hell of a lot nicer. I've been a hell of a lot nicer to people, some certain people, than they've been to me. And that's okay, because I think winning finishes all the sentences, because I'll be judged one day by no one on this earth, but by the Almighty. And I would never embarrass the memory of my two grandmothers who were flawless. And every day I wake up and care what 4 kids think and 4 teenagers think. So all that is fine, except let's be fair. I don't want to hear, well, Donald Trump said this, said that. The idea that a staffer would need 24/7 Secret Service protection as a staffer, you shouldn't even know my name. Because of the threats against my life and my safety and the house where my children lived, is insane. It's all you need to know. And shame on those now giving David Plouffe a hard time for, God forbid, expressing his First Amendment right to assemble and speak as he wants to. I think we need more of David Plouffe, not less, out in the conversation. I'm not surprised Kamala Harris wants to hire him, or that's what the rumors say. They'd be smart to try to grab him. I hope he doesn't, so he stays on the podcast. But sure, we should all be nicer. But you know what? That also starts at home. And I think social media, the poison keyboard has replaced the poison pen, and people think they can just write with impunity. I haven't read the notifications of the comments on Twitter or anywhere else in years. It has changed my life. I care very much what certain people think, and that's quantity. I mean, that's quality. I don't care what people who don't know me think. I pray for them. I don't know what's got people so miserable. Too many people living online. They need to get offline, go get some fresh air, a new hobby, some friends, look people in the eye, have a real conversation. That's just what we're trying to do with our podcast.
Yeah, I would just add, Dan, I think that, there's probably 30%, maybe 25% of the country that's really engaged in politics. Not all of them on social media, a lot of them aren't. I think they can distort our view of the rest of the country, right? Who I think, are just out there working hard and trying to take care of their families. And maybe they pay some attention to politics, maybe they none, or just at the end. But, I think that the folks, and I think this is not just like hard left, hard right, but there is this demonization of the other side. Now, what I think is we can say, you're wrong about this. This would do harm to this part of the country, the policy you want to interact in, that's bad. But, and listen, I think the Biden administration, we've seen there have been some opportunities and that were seized with Republicans and Democrats, even in this heated environment, to pass important legislation. So it can still happen, but it's important. But I just think at the end of the day, everybody has a role, because, yes, the media, I think, hopefully will reflect on a lot of different things, because they still are an important way that people get information. But, we have just, all of us have a platform now, because we have phones and we've got the ability to communicate. And so I think there is a good rule of thumb, which is before you say something or write something or post something, just really think about it for 60 seconds. And I think what happens then is maybe you'll either decide not to do it or phrase it a little bit differently. And I agree with Kellyanne. I haven't looked at notifications or mentions in forever, and it is a healthy thing. But that's a sad reflection. And listen, we are a divided country. We have big differences. I obviously feel strongly that the country would be very much disturbed by another second Trump term. Kellyanne feels as strongly the opposite way. And this is how we settle our disputes, is at the ballot box. Somebody wins, and for that period of time, they get to try and enact our agenda. And taking back to the podcast, like, why all this matters is, as silly as politics can seem to people sometimes, and as mean as it can seem, it matters, because somebody wins and somebody decides whose taxes gets raised or cut, who gets healthcare, who doesn't, what wars we fight or don't, who gets put in positions of responsibility. Like, it matters a great deal. And so I just think at the end of the day, I always tell Democrats, I remember going back, Kellyanne, to 2000. I was running the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee then. I wasn't part of the Gore campaign, but, Democrats were really upset about the Supreme Court. I didn't think that was the right decision, but as it turns out, Gore would have lost Florida with a full recount. But so the answer there is just, you got to win the election, right? So like, if you don't want bad things to happen as you see it, like half the country would say those are good things, you got to win the election. And so I think Kellyanne and I talking about not just our experiences, but how we evaluate this campaign and what's going on, I think is important, because one of these candidates is going to win, and it will affect the entire world. And so I always tell young people that, which is when they say, I don't want to get involved in politics, I say, I completely understand that. But, you probably do care about, tax rates, and you probably care about education, you probably care about healthcare. So at the end of the day, none of those at their root are not policy decisions. They all start as an electoral decision, right? And I think if we had a little bit understanding of that, that would be great.
Well, I know we're only scratching the surface, and we need to move you guys along, but I do want to share this. So I think regardless of how this campaign turns out, I think what you're doing is very important. You may have seen that Ben Shapiro and some CEOs were on Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago talking about the metrics that are being used under the guise of brand safety in advertising, and how that's impacting a lot of creators and publishers, and what gets monetized and what doesn't, because they came up with a framework that are now being used to score media. Now, like I said, we've been doing this podcast for 4 years, and our main objective has been to figure out how do we help advertisers align their sponsorship with their values, but not in an arbitrary way and not in a politicized way. The GARM framework that the industry has been adopting is not working. And I think Ben was right, but I don't think he's right for the reason he thinks he's right. And I've told him this. Everybody gets screwed by those standards because it flags keywords. And if you say Biden, Trump, Israel, Hamas, whatever you say is just using the word, advertisers are shown that they're in a high-risk environment, they back away. So what we've done is we partnered with a firm to create a one single metric that we're trying to get advertisers to use. It's called the Civility score. It only measures personal attack, concentration of personal attack in a podcast. And by looking at that, you're actually able to understand it's not about, you can talk about anything you want. You can have any opinion that you want. But if you have to make your case by personally attacking somebody else, then you get dinged for that and the advertiser can see it. And I'll just tell you, Sean Hannity has a 79 civility score. The Lincoln Project has a 79 civility score. Shapiro has 69. Pod Save America has 73. You want to know what the campaign managers have? 93.
Wow.
So very well done. And that's why we're doing it, right? We want to show that there is a difference between somebody going and surrounding themselves by people that agree with them and just saying their points and making it personal. If we can get advertisers to make decisions based on people making arguments, but not making them personal, we think we may be able to, have a positive impact from our little corner of the world. So that's what we're doing. And I'm really grateful that you guys came on to just be a part of this conversation. If there's anything else you got time to share, I'd love to hear it, but I know you got busy weeks.
Well, thanks.
So yeah,
it's a real important contribution to the ecosystem. And thanks for sharing that great score with us. Thanks for having us today.
The way we end.
Thank
you, Dan. And thank you, David Plouffe, for this partnership. I'll just leave you with the way we leave our podcast every week. We just say it's easy to be enraged. It's essential to be engaged. Big difference.
Amen. Well, thank you both. We'll see you at the next one. And hopefully some brands will take note of what you're doing here. It's important.
Awesome. Appreciate that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all so much for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use your influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. If you have feedback for us, we love to get your feedback. good, bad, or otherwise, just send us a note at info@mediaroundtable.com. Do not forget to check out our creative-focused podcast called Ad Infinitum, hosted by the great Stu Redwine. Special thanks to our guests, Kellyanne and David, and to Haley, Bianca, Kyle, Ezra, Mary Jane, Everett, Neil, Kareen, the team at Sharp Pen Media, the team at Podcast One. And as always, everybody, influence responsibly.